Hello my friends, Hank here, and in recognition of the big 80th anniversary of Operation Overlord coming up, today we're going to learn how to make a basic D-Day Beach Diorama. Rather than replicate a specific portion of one of the beaches themselves, in this video I'm going to show you guys how to make some of the most common beach obstacles that the Allies ran into along the Atlantic Wall, as well as some simple techniques for how to recreate the look and feel of the Normandy beaches themselves. That way, you can use these techniques to create whatever particular scene you'd like using any vehicles or figures you have. So let's jump into it. First things first, our base is going to be this square of XPS foam. These work quite well for this sort of project, and as always, I'll have links to all of the materials we use today down in the description below. Before we do any groundwork on our beach here, we need to build up some of our obstacles. The first one we're going to tackle is what's called a hembalken. This is essentially a big ramp made out of logs, and these were designed to impede the travel of landing craft approaching the beach at high tide and hopefully even capsize them, if the defenders were lucky enough. Also, these are the defenses that were infamously backwards in the now iconic opening scene of Saving Private Ryan. Oops. To build these, we're just going to forge some sticks and twigs from our backyard or whatever green area is around you. Just some skinny little ones about this size. And we're going to break ourselves two longer portions, a little longer than finger length, and then two shorter legs, sort of like this. And now, making a little triangle with the shorter legs, we can just put a dab of super glue on there to hold them in place until the glue cures. At this point, we don't need to press these into the foam, we'll get to that later. And once the legs are dry, we're going to glue our two longer ramp portions into place leaning against them, like so. And while that sets up, let's build ourselves another hembalken. After the glue dries completely and we have a solid little structure here, we can take some of our fine 28 gauge wire and wind that all around the connection points of our beach obstacle. After all, these weren't just super glued together in real life. Now, no two hembalken were exactly the same, of course. These aren't factory-made pieces of equipment, these are built by the Axis soldiers defending the Atlantic Wall. So some have two support struts, some have one, they're all a little different, so don't worry about them being too perfect. With our two hembalken complete, let's move on to another quite simple beach obstacle here, called a hockfalle, which is essentially just a big old tree trunk. Doesn't need to be complicated to be effective. Thousands of these big wooden stakes were driven into the beaches along the Atlantic coast to once again serve as hazards to landing craft at high tide. If one of these shallow draft, thin-skinned landing craft smacks into one of these stakes, bad news. Now, these stakes varied in size and height quite a bit. Some were taller and further offshore, some were skinnier and closer to shore, so again, don't be too concerned about the size and placement of these. Let's just take a few pieces of stick here and jam them into the front of our XPS foam at a gently sloping angle towards the quote-unquote ocean. Alright, now next let's create another significantly more dangerous version of the hockfalle. This is called a Minenfall. Essentially the same concept here, a big stake driven into the beach, but these Minenfall have mines strapped to the top, so if a landing craft sails into one of these, bad news. So here I've grabbed a few Teller mines from a German weapons accessory set that I had in the stash, and we can snip off two short portions of our 28 gauge wire to create a little bracket for our mine to attach to the top of our post. Using a bit of super glue, we can just align these two strips here in a basic little X shape. I unfortunately lost a bit of footage here, but once our mine brackets are ready, we can just glue the Teller mine on top of one of our hockfalle and gently bend the brackets over the top of the mine to make it look like they're holding it in place there. Now, sometimes you would see smaller little posts driven into the base of these various obstacles to help secure them in the sand, so I've gone ahead and snapped off some small portions of dowel and pushed those in place around our obstacles like so. In addition, I had a few Czech hedgehogs left over from another model that I'd built up. These welded steel obstacles have more or less become synonymous with the D-Day landings, so I decided to place a few towards the back of my diorama as well. Alright, so with all of our obstacles in place, let's add some beach texture here. Before we actually add any of our texture material, it can be helpful to add a bit of masking tape around the border of the base just to keep that nice and tidy for a clean finish down the road. Now, for our main base texture of the beach, I've mixed up a very thin batch of Durham's water putty, and we're going to carefully pour this around our beach obstacles here. And then using a brush, we can help guide this into place along all the nooks and crannies of our obstacles. We're shooting for complete coverage of the foam itself, but it doesn't need to be a consistent layer all the way through. After all, this is a beach, it shouldn't be perfectly flat. Before our putty dries, we can take some sand and sprinkle that all over our base. This is literally just sand I gathered from my local beach. Doesn't need to be anything fancy. All of the Normandy beaches were a little bit different. Some had finer yellow sand, some were rockier. I'm leaning into the rockier effect here because that's just what I have, but it's totally up to you, so don't worry if your sand isn't super fine. Alright, once our putty is dried completely, I gave mine a full overnight to cure, we can go ahead and shake off our excess sand, and now we've got ourselves a bit of beach texture. And at this point, we can finally move on to painting. First things first, as always, let's prime our entire diorama in flat black so that we can have a solid, consistent base to work up from. And for our first sand color, we're going to go ahead and load up some of this sand gray and spray this all over our groundwork. Once that's on there, we can take a little Dunkelgelb and spray that into a few sections as well. This adds a little depth and variety to our basic sand texture here. And then finally, we can take some cyanide gray and lightly spray that over most of our groundwork as well. This is going to add a nice, cooler effect to our sand and help us create the cold morning air of that fateful day along the coast of France. Alright, with our airbrush work all set here, next we can go ahead and dry brush some of our raised rocks and pebbles on the beach to help accentuate that depth and texture. I've loaded up my brush with a little bit of German field gray. And now let's paint the beach obstacles themselves. First, we can start by painting all of our wooden elements with a bit of beige brown. And then we'll take a little wood paint and we'll dry brush that right on there as well. This is going to help give a little variation to our stakes. Next, let's get a bit of camo medium brown to paint up our smaller support stakes. Again, this will add a little variation between our various wooden elements. And then for our Czech hedgehogs, we're just going to paint these up in an all-over orange rust color. This looks a little heavy-handed at first, but once we weather these up a bit, they'll look perfect. Alright, next let's grab a little German field gray and paint up our teller mines on top of our beach obstacles. You can see here I've also added one of the mines to the top of a hembalken, which was also a commonly used strategy where the extra mines were available. And with the basic paint work done on our beach obstacles, we can switch gears here and start to replicate our wet sand effects. If you've been to any beach before, you've probably noticed that there are always several layers of wetness to the sand. Some hasn't been hit by the tide at all, some was underwater more recently than other bits, some is still wet. This is all dependent on the shape of the beach and the tide itself. So we're going to try and replicate a few stages of wetness here. Some dry beach, some drying beach, and some actively wet beach. For our drying portion here, we're going to load up our brush with some enamel dark wash and start to create a surf line, as in a wave that washed up the beach relatively recently and stopped right here. So everything behind this line is going to get a little bit of dark wash. And while we have our dark wash out, let's just be sure to hit all of our beach obstacles with a quick little sludge wash here to help accentuate the details, make things a little less pristine looking. Alright, so here you can see I've let our surf line dry completely. I went ahead and added a second, slightly darker surf line as well, because waves come in numbers, of course. They always roll up the beach a little differently, but it's a pretty cool effect in any case. And at this point, I decided that the dry portion of my beach looked a little too flat, so decided to pinpoint and brush in a little color on some of the various pebbles up here. Using a variety of earth tones, blacks, grays, browns, etc., I just dotted in a little color on some of these rocks. And I do think that looks quite a bit better. Alright, so now we're going to add our wet layer of sand. This is the section that's actually got receding surf on it in the moment. To achieve this look, we're going to brush some gloss Mod Podge in along its own surf line at the front of our diorama. Now, don't worry, this is going to dry crystal clear and give us a nice glossy finish, almost as if this section of the beach still has water on it. And there, as you can see, just like magic, once that Mod Podge is dry, we've got ourselves a pretty amazing looking portion of beach. All that's left to do now is just paint in the border of our base with some flat black to give it a nice, clean final presentation. And now we have ourselves a beautiful recreation of the Normandy beach and the beach defenses heading up to that fateful day in June of 1944. I hope you guys enjoyed the video and that these tips will be helpful for your own projects. Again, if you need any links to the materials we used today, those will be down in the description below. And until next time, my friends, be well, happy building, cheers.